Howdy BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast content. On this episode number 24, we're thrilled to have Christy Pambianchi with us, who is the Chief People Officer at Intel. She's also been at some amazing Fortune 50 and Fortune 100 companies, so stay tuned. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Why People podcast, episode number 24. For our new listeners, Why People is a Boston HR Council production. The BHRC is one of the largest HR and people executive communities in the world, with just under 1,500 council members. First, would like to introduce co-founder of the BHRC and co-host of Why People, Paul Roberts.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning to all. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And now we will introduce our guest. We're thrilled to have Christy Pambianchi on with us, who is the Chief People Officer at Intel. Christy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the podcast today.
Yeah, Christy, we're thrilled too. We were joking before the recording. Christy is a New York Yankees fan and is situated in the New York area, so that will make for some fun context here. But Christy, really, we follow the same kind of conversational format here, and of course, everyone's path is so uniquely different, so it makes for just a really fun and interesting conversation. If you wouldn't mind, kind of help get us rooted here, could you tell the audience and us just a little bit about your background? And you can go as far back as you want. Some folks go all the way back to the cradle. Some folks go back to college. But just help us, root us a little bit in who Christy is.
That's really fun. I'm really looking forward to sharing and talking with you and the listeners today. For me personally, I grew up in Brewster, New York, so Putnam County, a little bit north of New York City, and was in a family. I'm the oldest of four, and my parents moved out of the city with us to raise us in what was then the country. And I was an exchange student to Germany in high school for a year. And before that, I had spent a summer in Japan as an exchange student and had hosted some exchange students at my house. So I got very, very interested in kind of global relations, but also like the way people live in different cultures. And so I was able to get into Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations, and that began that study. And at the time, I thought I might pursue a career in law and international relations. And so I was actually trying to, in addition to being fluent in English and German, trying to become fluent in Russian. And so as I was taking those classes, I wound up spending a semester in Washington, D.C., working in a law firm, and really realized I did not like the work in being a lawyer. And so was one of the benefits of an internship. Like I really tried it out, and I worked there for an entire semester for 15 credits. And I compiled the legislative history of the WARN Act. And I thought this was interesting intellectually, but not how I could see myself spending my life working. So back at the ILR school for my, rest of my junior year, the second semester junior year, I really delved into all of my elective classes in human resources because I had all of the foundational coursework. And that summer, spent my summer as an intern in the GEHR intern program and fell in love with the HR work. So my senior year, I was able to complete a lot of the electives that set up the foundation for, the way I've been able to apply HR over the course of my career. And so I share that just because I think it's so interesting and valuable to get internships and try work out. If you go into grade schools on, career day, there's not a lot of 7-year-olds that are sort of like, hey, I want to be a human resource executive or leader. So it's not a career or a path that's that well understood until you're really in the workplace. So I'm very grateful for the opportunities I had from my internships and to really get the experience of the work. And I'll give a little more in my personal background, why I think now, upon reflection, I fell in love with it so much. So when I was growing up, my dad worked for what was then Ma Bell, and it was before the breakup of AT&T. And so I was in high school when they broke up AT&T, and my dad was, displaced and, moved around into what eventually became NYNEX. My aunt, who lived in our home and helped raise us because my mom passed when I was very young, she was the telephone operator at the phone company as well. And so she got split into what became like one of the baby bells in New York. And I just had such a front seat to how corporate restructurings and the world of work really impacts people on a personal level. And there was, a fairly constant amount of disruption and not a very positive labor relations environment at the phone company. So I grew up with that as well. So for me, one of the things I learned early on was what you do and the job that you have affects everything else in your life. So I think that was why when I was an intern working on legislative history, the WARN Act, it was super interesting, but it was pretty alone and isolated. And I was just working in a library, combing through congressional records to compile the 10-year history of that. Whereas when I was an intern working in human resources, I was, in a manufacturing plant, working on a business team, working with actual employees, and really thinking a lot about how the work that we were doing in HR was going to actually affect the lives of the employees, as well as obviously the productivity or the effectiveness of the operation. And so for me, that's sort of the very, very early roots. And I also worked since I was 13. And I had a lot of jobs that all of us have, when we're young, whether it's a lifeguard or I worked in a local roadside, hamburger and, fast food restaurant, or, in college, I worked in dining. So had a lot of, job experiences up along the way that make you really appreciate how hard people work and how much pride they have in their job and how much their job enables their life, regardless of what work that is.
Well, Christy, I mean, thanks for sharing and so many fascinating kind of tidbits there. It's neat. This is episode 24, as I mentioned on the welcome. So I'm starting to lose track. But you're definitely not the first of our guests that started out down the law track and said, maybe not, maybe something else is better for me. So that's fascinating. A question I kind of love to ask is, when you did decide to lean into some of the more human resources focused courses and kind of thought about it through that internship, I guess, a question is, what did you know about HR or the function or kind of like what that landscape looked like at the time versus what you know now? Like tell us a little bit about that delta,
Fortunately, my first 2 years, I had a pretty strong underpinning in the ILR program. There's some very generic, classes that entry freshmen and sophomores take, like macro micro econ, intro to psychology, but also we had to take labor law. We had to take classes that went over organizational behavior, an overview of collective bargaining. So by the time you're in the sophomore year, you're given a pretty broad overview of some of the underpinnings that support an HR function in a company, and including an introduction to HR. So when I came back from my internship, both working in DC in the law firm, as well as my summer at General Electric in their HR trainee program, I really leaned into the electives that I could then take for my junior and senior year. So I was able to take, classes on compensation and the theories of pay and designing comp systems, or, advanced, labor economics, advanced classes in organizational behavior, structure, staffing, all of these kind of principles, and really helped build out. And what was so rich about it was, because I did an internship, I kind of saw what it looked like when it was stood up in a company. And so I strongly encourage your listeners, if they're thinking about a career in HR or early in their career, those internships are so valuable to complement the study. And so I felt like my last 3 semesters were supercharged because of how much I had learned from my semester working and my summer working.
That's helpful, kind of helping us understand, Chrissy. And just curious, during your studies, were there any professors or leaders, anybody that you look back on and say, wow, that was a pioneer and I didn't even know it. That was kind of a beacon of, what, the impact I could have on people in the workplace. Any kind of like remembering back and saying, wow, that person really made a difference.
So I was so fortunate to have so many fabulous professors and early supervisors in my career that really helped shape and advance my thinking and my capabilities. I'm very grateful for. George Milkovich was the professor that actually kind of wrote the book on compensation. and I was in his class, and the class had, this was a class size of like 20 students. And so I went on to continue to take classes with him, as many as I could. But I would say didn't sort of recognize the heft or the weight of, at the time, what an early expert he was in helping kind of shape and kind of write the textbook on it. I also was a student of, really excellent economists, Ron Ehrenberg and Gary Fields, who I stayed in touch with over the early, decade of my career, continuing to learn. And then later, I stayed very close in contact with Cornell, and in the human resource department, professors like John Boudreau and Pat Wright and Chris Collins are all individuals that I had the opportunity to study from and then learn with over my career. I still have a relationship with them and learn from them to this day.
How's your Russian and German today?
I'm still fluent in German. Ich spreche Deutsch und ich habe Verwandtschaft in Deutschland. And I have very, very little, very little Russian left. I took 12 credits. And at the time, I knew from going to Germany, I became fluent in 3 months because I lived with a family. I went to a high school. I took 12 credits of Russian and, could barely string together a couple of sentences after many, many hours of work. And at that time, it wasn't possible to be an exchange student. I, sort of at that time, as a young person, if, all of us are hoping for world peace, and I grew up in the Cold War. So I thought if I could speak German and Russian, I could be at an international, with a law degree, I could be an international diplomat and be part of the ushering in an era of world peace. So that was sort of the genesis behind that. Now I'm trying to pick up Spanish again because I learned a lot of Spanish in high school. So I try to do Duolingo every day. I'm on the side, do something else to expand my brain.
I really wish Sean or I were fluent in German right now so we could engage, but fortunately we're still working on English together, right, Sean?
We'll have to lean on the audience to confirm. That sounded pretty good to me, Christy. Well, Christy, this is kind of a great background to get us started, and we have some ground to cover. You've done some pretty amazing things in your career, so help us kind of build that bridge from kind of academia, your internship, into a full-time professional position, and kind of what that felt like for you.
Yeah. When I was beginning my career, there was sort of this fork in the road. Did you want to go and practice HR in what was, sort of the industrial sector or into the services sector? And so I made the decision that I wanted to go into the industrial sector and start my career in HR with a manufacturing background and a company that was in sort of the industrial sector. So I joined Pepsi as my first employer, and I spent my first 10 years there. And for me, that choice was, I really wanted to be able to work with frontline employees. I wanted to get experience with labor unions, having studied labor relations, and I wanted to work in a company where there was a lot of role models in the HR department. And Pepsi fulfilled all of those aspirations that I had coming into my career.
And it's interesting, Christy. A lot of commonality, obviously a lot of differences between all of our guests, but there's some common themes. Cornell's came up a whole bunch. A lot of Cornell folks. I think we even had someone who led the HR function at Cornell or one of the Cornell schools. Pepsi has came up a bunch as well, and it seems like one of those organizations that seem to be onto something a little bit earlier on than most relative to HR. I'm just curious. Tell us a little bit about that. And you see a whole bunch of folks leading the function at different organizations who spent time at Pepsi. Any kind of thoughts or feedback on that?
Yeah, so super interesting. And, GE was phenomenal as well. And I had the opportunity to work at GE, but I was 21 when I was graduating, and it was pretty clear the aerospace business was going to get sold, and I was going to be working in the aerospace business in the HRMP program. And I just thought that was just not how I wanted to start my career. That felt too risky. So I took the position at Pepsi, and I did work in the New England area. My boss was in Waltham, and I, at one point at 22 and until I was 24, was the ER. It was called the Employee Relations Representative for New Hampshire and Bangor, Maine, based in Manchester. So for your Boston area BHRC members, I definitely know the area really well. And so I think the early ingredients of success at Pepsi have to all be attributed to Mike Feiner. And Mike Feiner was the head of HR before I arrived at Pepsi, and probably in the 80s, for a decade or so, really built up the really, really strong underpinning of how important talent was to the success of the company. And so no matter who you were, what level you were, you did not get an offer in HR unless you passed your Mike Feiner interview. So I remember being so scared for everybody told me I was going to get an offer, but I had to pass that interview. And, imagine if every CHRO interviewed every single hire in their department off campus. Pretty impressive. And I think the underlying ingredient that he then drove was he had a super strong partnership with the CEO, and they treated, human capital with the same level of passion and focus and commitment that they treated capital allocation and the brand. And so when you put that on equal par with, at the C-suite, you really make a couple of big decisions, and the rest you have to let the organization do. So you're deciding capital allocation, you're deciding your strategy, in Pepsi's case, brand, and then what human capital do you deploy? And I think that was some of what really made it successful early on. And then I think because HR was still coming up as a profession in the 90s when I joined it, I think there was an over tilt also toward let's hire super qualified talent and invest heavily in them so that they could help build up the function and its impact within the company. And then it was definitely a sink or swim kind of ramp. So you got, and that was a little bit what I signed up for. I felt like I had worked a lot, so I wasn't necessarily looking to join a rotational program. I wanted to kind of jump in the deep end of the pool, and I credit them with that as well. At 21, I spent a year at headquarters, sort of as a free on-loan resource to anyone in the Northeast region that had a project. So I kind of got the bottom of the barrel. Any work that somebody in business HR didn't get to or want to do, it was like, call Christy and she'll have to come here to our market unit and do it. But sometimes, again, by doing sort of the lowest level tasks, the least desirable work, you learn the most. So one of my advice tips later in the podcast to your listeners will be, don't shy away from hard work or big, ugly projects or things that look like they're going to be tough. Those are actually where you usually learn the most. And then at 22, like I mentioned, I was given an assignment. I was the employee relations representative for 6 locations, 3 labor contracts, 3 union-free sites. And that's it, me. There was no other, I had no resources. I had me and my Nissan Sentra that didn't even have air conditioning. And I, drove around to my locations. And, my first week when I arrived in Manchester, so excited with my, little spring in my step, my cute little Cornell degree and a year of experience. And I think I'm like super valuable. And first of all, they give me an office, and, within the first week, they're like, we don't really know why you're here, and we think you're a waste of money. We'd rather have an extra merchandiser. And did corporate send you to spy on us? And you're sitting there like, okay, I thought, that was not in any of the classes I took. That was not in any of my internship experiences. And so, sitting there, I was sort of like, okay, I'm going to win these guys over the hard way. And that's really where you dig deep, and working in dining and mowing lawns and being a lifeguard and, having all the jobs I had really taught me that it's so important to meet people where they are. And you got to earn their respect. Who cares that I went to Cornell and had this great corporate experience? To the employees of Manchester and Concord and Claremont, New Hampshire, I was just an HR person from corporate, and that seemed like, what's she up to?
That's awesome, Christy, and I love hearing you say that, right? Because it is so true. Oftentimes, even in interviews now, with folks that are entering the workforce, it seems like folks are kind of quick to gloss by some of the jobs they've had, right? As a waiter or a waitress, or an attendant somewhere, or on a construction site, or a landscaper, and geez, I mean, some of the most valuable traits one can learn. You can make the argument just overall as far as life skills, but certainly professionally, are learned in some of those areas. So I love that you touched on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I worked in dining, I worked full time. I worked like 30 hours a week my first year. And then sophomore year, I became a supervisor in dining, and you supervise students and full-time employees that worked in the dining unit at Cornell. And again, I worked about 30 hours a week. and I worked full time this summer to be trained to be the supervisor. And that is like being a frontline supervisor in a plant. And you cannot imagine how much learning is accelerated. And that probably helped propel what I learned both in the law firm and my summer at GE, but it stuck with me my whole career. And I definitely take with any job I have a servant mindset. Like my job is to serve the enterprise, serve the employees, serve the managers, and ultimately to help optimize and drive performance for the company, but also satisfaction and life fulfillment for the employees that I get to work with. But I agree with you; those experiences are so valuable, and have made me a much better employee and manager over the arc of my life.
Well, Christy, I'll ask you a question here, but my ask is if it's coming later down the road as we kind of continue this journey to hold on it. But a question is, and we ask this to all of our guests, and it's really interesting to see where in their journey it happened. But I'm curious, relative to the work that you do now and the work that even it sounds like you were doing at an earlier age, tell us a little bit about the bifurcation of HR as this collection of administrative functions and HR as a strategy for people to drive business outcomes and to be happy with where they work. Like those two things are so separate, and it's interesting to me where folks understand that or where folks said, oh, there's a lot more to this at a strategic level. At this point, are you already there? Does it come a little bit later? I'm just curious.
I would say I already understood that because I was thrown out into the field with no resources. And so, you were everything. I was sort of like answer my benefit question to the corporate is restructuring the, districts into regions and everybody's jobs changed. And how do I help them transform? And so you were definitely, absolutely in those days, a jack of all trades, and you had to do both. And firsthand, you kind of learned that back to people telling me I was a waste of money and they'd rather have a merchandiser. How I earned their respect was taking care of some of those basic things for them, like deciphering the SPD benefit plan that we still, gave them a manual copy of, or helping them understand something about, a career trajectory that they could be on that they didn't know, like helping take care of some super basic things for them, then they let me then into their professional circles, their relationships, made me a trusted member, not just of the management team, but of the workforce. And then you start to, I'd go on route rides, I'd, work in the manufacturing plant when I transferred down to DC. When I joined Corning, I'd go out into the operations all the time. And that's actually where you find out a lot of what's actually going on. And so you can design things and think they're going to be amazing wherever you're sitting in your conference room or your headquarters building or your regional office. But when you actually go out in the front line, you're sort of like, have the courage to ask people, how's this going? Like, how do you like this program? Or how do you like this benefit? Or what do you think about this policy? Or what do you think about the strategy? How are we doing as a company? And really listen. And I like to say, so I kind of learned some of that early on. I wouldn't have had the words to describe it that way. And then I would say it's coming a little bit later when I started at Corning in the optical fiber business. It was definitely still evolving in terms of a strategic HR footprint at Corning. And so there was a view that was very much like personnel management in manufacturing. And so I kind of brought it all together and said, no, we're going to have human resources for the optical fiber business. And I actually leaned on Dave Ulrich's 2x2 model that I still think is great and holds a lot of water to this day. And it's sort of like below the line is the basics and above the line is strategic. And, and so you don't get the luxury and you're not invited to do things above the line that are strategic if you can't do the basics, right? So if you're messing up payroll, no one wants to have you come in and talk about, let's do annual talent planning and build a pipeline and a pool of future plant managers. They're like, how about you go back in your corner and get payroll right? So I think it's not a bifurcation. It's like a layer. You don't get to access and have contribution at that higher level if you can't do the fundamentals. And that I think so I think they're both super important. And I was able to use that model to actually bring the leaders of the optical fiber business together to say, these all go together, and how we do the daily transactional pieces build trust every day with our employees that we're doing what we said we were going to do. We're creating and, delivering on our end of the components of their work life that are important to them or to the managers. And then you could sort of bleed in, what would be great, right? We could have a multi-year view of what workforce we're going to need 5 years from now or 3 years from now, or we could think about who we're competing with and what's our employee value proposition. You start talking about all those things, no one's listening if those other things aren't going well. Right? If you can't fill a requisition, if your fill time is, XYZ days too long, or the processes are cumbersome, et cetera, the managers will just go around you and write you off.
Christy, yeah, thanks for kind of situating us there. And so, yeah, now kind of help work through some of the really cool stops along the way. Because I've done the obligatory, Christy, LinkedIn stalking. Like, you've been at some pretty amazing places. Tell us a little bit about each stop and kind of what the thought process was, both personally and professionally.
Yeah. So as I was approaching 30, there was this thing called internet, and I was super passionate about technology. So on the side, I'm kind of a closet geek. And my last few years at Pepsi, I was definitely, working with and seeing the emergence of technology. And I did the first CD-ROM based digital learning, 14 hours of training, teaching route salesmen how to be route salesmen in a game, a video game on a CD-ROM and training labs around the country. So that was super exciting. And I sat there thinking this was going to be the technology that really shaped my time on Earth. We all get so much time on Earth. And I was very, very passionate about, I told you I grew up in a household of employees from the telephone company. So it definitely had that root. And as I saw fiber networks being laid globally and the whole concept of the internet emerging, I thought I'd really love to be a part of that. And so at around 30, I moved to Corning Incorporated. They were the inventor of optical fiber. And I was super excited about that opportunity and joined as their head of HR for the optical fiber business unit. And within a year became the head of HR for their optical communications segment. So there was there's both, you've got to lay the optical fiber, but then also there's the networking and the photonic devices that help with all the junctions and send the light all the places it needs to go. So I'll leave it at that. And so that was something I was super passionate about. And I joined right at the ramp of the internet. So it was 2000. We couldn't build fiber factories fast enough. So it was really coming into a situation where scaling the business was really important. Scaling the business was really important, and there hadn't been, I would say, a very strategic lens on human resources in the company. So that's where I leaned on the Ulrich model to say, I'm going to do all these things really, really well. I'm going to integrate them and make sure they're simple for this business. But we have to do these above the line things so that we have the ability to get ahead of, building all the factories, scaling and expanding the ones that we had in existence already. We were doing a big M&A integration of the companies that we had bought around the world for the fiber capacity. So that was like this crazy run up. But I will tell you from firsthand experience, it's the cycles down where you learn the most. And then there was this thing called the .com crash, and that hurt, and that was super painful. And we were sold out and building factories. And around December of 2001, we were by the end of 2000 into early 2001, Nortel was canceling all their orders from the photonic business, but the fiber business was still sold out. And by May of 21, we were working on reduction plans because we were nervous about the .com crash coming. And by October, we were closing a factory. And it pursued for 2 more years, and the company almost went bankrupt. Our stock was 300 at the peak of the run-up. We split 3-1. So then the stock split to 100 each, and everybody was like super excited. Now they have 3 shares. And then by the end of the .com crash, the company was at $1.67. And there was a CEO transition. The last founding family member, Jamie Houghton, this is a 160-year-old company, the Houghton family. Jamie came off the board to be CEO. So I got to work with Jamie, right? And just see what he and Wendell Weeks did with the management committee at that time to say, okay, and Jamie just had the tagline, "We will survive." That was the strategy for the year. We will survive. And the only business goal was to return to profitability because we were losing money and stay solvent. And then like the multi-year plan we put together to put the company back on track. It's an innovation company. right? So there's about 10% of revenue that goes to innovation and material science research. Then we would make proprietary manufacturing plants and then get designed into solutions. And this is, typically 5 or 6 businesses: optical fiber, LCD glass. At the time was not a scaling business. We'd invented it for about 20 years. We couldn't get anybody to buy it. But then ultimately someone named Steve Jobs decided to put it on an iPhone. And before that, the television manufacturers decided this was the time to take LCD glass live. And that was sort of the rocket business that took off while the telecom business was in recession. And so really, really formative experience going through that and being at the job and the level I was in. I felt like it was a parallel to my first 10 years at Pepsi. I was always very young and given really big assignments. And so here I was in my early 30s. I was 31, 32, 33, working with the CEO and COO to restructure the company, reimagine what are the requirements of a general manager in a new world where technology is half-lifing itself. If you had previously invented something and had the IP, you could have a 20 to 30 year run running that business while your other inventions took hold. That time was getting cut in half. And so that meant we needed a whole different profile. So I got to do work on how do you stand up talent planning where it had been dissolved. At Pepsi, I got to understudy one of the most successful talent planning systems put in place. At Corning, I had to build it. Right. But I got to do it while understanding how you rebuild a company. So I would say that was some of the really, really formative experiences I had going through the wild ride up and the absolute crash, and then rebuilding the company. And what we did was Jamie forced this maniacal analysis of where did we go wrong? It's not enough about how do we fix it? What do we need to do going forward? But really from a true postmortem and very much an engineering culture. And I found at Corning, I really fell in love with engineering culture. And that carries through to what I love about Intel today as well, right? In an engineering culture, you are super self-critical, right? You're always looking for, not just let's pat ourselves on the back and have a lot of accolades because something went well. You're always then thinking, but what's the next thing that could go wrong? Okay, here's this product we've invented. It's great, but here's the new features that aren't good enough yet. And so you can apply that to business practices. You can apply that to HR. And so that's some of the discipline I learned coming out of that experience. And so that really helped us turn Corning around, but that also then helped me learn the operating model for how to stand up and run an HR department that I kind of built in 2003 at Corning with the chief HR officer at the time, Kurt Fisher. He and I built that together, and I've used that operating model for the 16 years I've been a CHRO.
Christy, I feel like we could have an MBA course on what we just talked about in the last 3 minutes here. I want to ask a gazillion questions because I do want to get to kind of present time and then get into some advice. But I guess a question to help us, stay on the journey here. At what point did you know, or did you ever know, that leading the overall function, leading HR and people at a large organization was what you wanted to do?
So that's a great question. So I tend to plan in 10-year milestones. So when I was starting my career at 21 and I joined Pepsi, my goal at the time was to become an HR director. And that was where you had a region and you were the HR person. There was maybe 10 regions in the country. And that was sort of my aspiration. And that I thought it would take a decade to do that. And so I tried to build all the foundational experiences to be a candidate for that. And I achieved that. And as I was turning 30, 28, 29, 30, I started thinking about what do I want to do from 30 to 40? And on the personal side, I wanted to have 4 children. And on the professional side, I felt like I was at a fork in the road because I seriously considered academia. And so I went and met with the professors I named, and I debated, do I want to try to go down the academic path, get a PhD, and have my family, and then become a professor? Because at the time, there was still very few practitioners teaching. And even with my 10 years of experience, I thought I had something to give already. While I hadn't been a CHRO, I'd had enough that I thought I could build on that. Or if I stayed in the profession, what did I want to achieve? And so it was at that moment when I said, I'm going to stay in the profession, in the operational side, but first the academic side. That was when I put the marker up that, okay, if I'm going to do this, I want to be a CHRO. And so at 30, I started to try to lay the foundation of what do I need to do to be ready to be a CHRO. And so I have come up through business HR in my time at Pepsi, so to get an HR director job, you had to do two, 18 months, 24-month headquarter assignments. So I did mine in organizational capability. And so when I got to Corning, I ran all of business HR after the optical communications job, plus talent management. And I strongly believe people in CHRO jobs need to have experience in the business, really, really connect and understand what drives the company, how the company works, what are the strategic levers of the company, so you can contribute to how human capital advances that company, that business. But then at the same time, you need to know, how do I run an HR function? And you don't get that experience until you also then run some centers of excellence or do some really big COE work, because now you're not solving for just one business team or one business need. You have to think about the whole enterprise. And there's a whole lens of like risk and scale and governance that makes you think about the way you design offerings from a COE perspective that you don't appreciate when you're just on the business HR side, possibly complaining about it. So it makes, I like to make my team members eat their dog food and go both ways. And so that's when I knew at 30, I said, okay, well, this is what I want to do. And then I set out to do that. And I was very, very fortunate at 38 to get promoted to my first CHRO assignment.
That's awesome. And Christy, just being mindful of our time here and kind of really wrapping up this awesome conversation, give us a little bit of insight into the last 5 years. I mean, you've led the function at Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies. Like, it doesn't get too much bigger. Just give us a little idea of kind of what it's like.
I would say I've been a CHRO for 16 years, and the last 5 years have been the hardest, and each year seems to get harder. And I say that because so many things are going on, both in the business landscape as well as in the environment and the global situation around us, that's pulling on this job in ways that go far beyond the things I studied and told you I worked on the first 10 years of my career. So, in the 2000s, I had the good fortune of, standing up and leading the establishment of a crisis response process and system at Corning. There was multiple, they never became global pandemics, but there were a few regional disease situations that I managed as an example. So then at Verizon, when I show up at Verizon, it's 135,000 employees. So it's double the scale and size of the employee base at Corning, but it's 90% concentrated in the United States, where Corning had, 50 factories in 35 countries around the world and 55,000 employees. Now I had 135,000, like 90,000 concentrated in the United States. So like, size matters, but also there's a lot of different things that can make companies complicated too. So at Verizon, when I started, within the 6 months, the COVID outbreak in Wuhan happened. And I happened to be the leadership team member that crisis response ultimately for break glass situations rolled up. Like, I was the responsible party for that. And I felt really well equipped for it from my experience at Corning. We had a lot of footprint in Asia. And so when it left Wuhan, I met with the team that managed sort of the crisis response engine and said, okay, we're going to need to start to meet because this is going to go global. I just knew, because the countries and cultures like China, there's a huge cultural phenomena where if they're asked to do something, they will do it. They'll comply. So if under the compliance of all of those restrictive orders, the disease was still able to escape, I thought we have no chance. This is going global. And it did. And so early, so that was huge the last 5 years. And, working very closely with Hans, he was new CEO, and he brought me in to be part of his leadership team. And so it was like starting over again. I mean, your credentials get you in the door, but it never matters what level, what age, what title you come in with. You still have to earn it, right? People, like you said, like, they'll look you up on LinkedIn or the internet, and they'll be like, yeah, but prove it to me. So you still have to go back to, it felt like that moment where they said, I'd rather have a merchandiser, right? So even walking in as a C-suite member, I had in the back of my head, and I think everybody talks about this mini imposter syndrome, but still I had in my head, I got to earn it, right? I can't just rest on, these are all these great things I did as the CHRO for 12 years at Corning. And so there was a mantra to transform the culture, and because Pods had a whole new strategy, and we were going to drive for significant positive employee relations. And I had that childhood experience and a lot of tenets and history with this industry and that particular company. So that was something really important to me personally, as well as for Hans's strategy. And second, we were going to stand up and really focus on a few areas of HR that we're going to build on the legacy that Mark Reed, my predecessor, had established, but also really delve into new ways of organizing. We put wireless and wireline together, and we said, we're going to go to market the way the customer engages with Verizon, not from a product out perspective. So that we had to kind of like apply a lot of OD and change management skills to how we were going to bring the strategy to life. And after we put our 5-year strategy together in HR, we also thought that the team thought, let's like rebrand ourselves in the company. We want them to think of us differently. And then COVID happened. And it's like that .com crash. You never know when these horrible, horrible disruptive things are coming. But when they do, that is where you learn the most, and also you show up and your true values come out, and what you and your team are all about are on full display. And the HR team, I think we didn't sleep for months. And I'm so grateful for the amazing work that, not only I did, but my team. And through the first 6 months, when it hit New York, we had 45,000 people in the metro New York area. We were ground zero. We were infrastructure workers. We had, serious issues that were very early while the government still didn't know what was happening. There weren't clear policies. And we just stood up resources around the clock for our employees. We put super, obviously appropriate policies in place. And within a few months, employees viewed our department so differently. Instead of viewing us as the vice principal of the company, they viewed us as people that really were helping them and enabling them, whether it was a leader, a manager, or an employee. And the pride I could see on the faces of the HR team members, aside from the great work we were doing for the company, made me so happy. And, it continued from there. So transforming a culture, changing an entire business model, navigating a pandemic when your business is physically shut down, but you have to still operate. You grow a lot of other muscles beyond just knowing how to run a good compensation plan. And I made the transition to Intel because it's really important for the world that Intel survives as a company. And the challenges that Intel has, when I met with Pat Gelsinger, the CEO, and talked with him and researched the history and the arc at Intel, very much mirror the challenges that Corning had coming out of the 90s into the 2000s. And Clay Christensen's book, for anybody that hasn't read it, and he's a Harvard professor, so I'm throwing in some Boston props for your audience here. He has his sadly passed, but his book on the innovator's dilemma is spot on. When you invent a business, you don't see the competition, right? Intel invented semiconductors, invented chips. And so and that happened to Corning. It invented optical fiber. It invented the ceramic substrate that's in all your catalytic converters. And you just don't see the competition. And you often are only in duopolies. And so you can lose first position. And Intel lost first position. And that's what happened to Corning too. So I felt I was uniquely qualified to help Pat on something that's of, we believe, national and global security to make sure Intel survives. And so I'm here applying all the things I've learned from all the hard turns I've taken in my corporate career, whether it's the .com crash or COVID or the financial crisis. And now here trying to build Intel. And it's a fabulous company, but the job is hard, right? And we've got super dedicated employees. There's a very, very competitive talent environment for, engineers, for technicians, for software engineers, for AI experts. And when you are the large employer in an area, you typically hire, build, train those skill sets. And then I'm the person often being rated to help fuel the ecosystem or the supply chain or the general geo area where I am. So my team and I are working on lots of exciting HR challenges to help restore Intel to the position of leadership and build the foundry business.
Christy, and we could do a podcast series on leading, Verizon and Intel, right? Post, pre-COVID and post-COVID. So thanks for kind of running us through that. And just the last question here, and what we always finish with, because of this really cool podcast, we've had so many folks reach out to us and say, hey, I'm just graduating from college. I want to get into HR, or I'm in customer service and I want to make a transition to HR. So a question is, for anyone in that spot who wants to be, the next Christy Pambianchi, any advice on someone who's just entering into the HR workforce?
Yeah. So first, I think there's a lot of resources for anyone that wants to learn about HR. now that weren't really there 30 years ago when I started my career. So I would say definitely for someone that's considering it or interested in looking into the field, there's business schools and universities have really begun to build out HR management programs. So look into those. Of course, my alma mater, Cornell, has a lot of great resources, but I must say that there's others that have grown up around. And so that's the first place to start. But then I would say really, if you're in HR and you're building your career, I found you have to really think about the company you work at. And if you think about that, like really know the business. And for me, like it was intentional when I chose to work at Pepsi or to go work at Corning or Verizon or Intel. And at each, I had a personal passion about the mission or the kind of work I was going to get to do. And that transcends then being able to become an HR professional or contributor at those companies. And so I would say, if you're in that and thinking about it, think about what business you want to do that in. And I say that because that kind of shapes the kind of people problems that you work on, right? So when at my 21, it was like, am I going to go into the industrial sector or the service sector? And then I was in industrial. But then what industry do I want to be in? Do I want to be in the airline industry? Do I want to be in technology? Do I want to be in pharmaceutical? Do I want to be in retail, right? Because the actual talent that and the jobs that they have drive all different problems. In retail, you're going to have 200% turnover and mostly a part-time workforce. And how do you solve all those problems? Where here I'm working on how do I get technical talent and how do I help contribute to STEM education? How do I, et cetera. So I would like to tell people, students in particular, brands are very attractive. I get it. I went to work for Pepsi. It's like one of the top brands in the world. But I also encourage them to think about, okay, but then what kind of workers do they have at that company? And think about then what kind of talent and human capital projects and problems are you going to be working on? Are they exciting to you? And if they are, then you found your place. And then I also think we struggled a lot in the 80s and 90s to say, hey, we need a seat at the table and HR is a business partner and we're a business function too. And so I feel there was a lot of over tilt toward be a business person and almost like distance yourself from the fact that you're an HR person. And I'm the opposite. Run and embrace that. And I like to tell people, be an actual expert at HR, right? And don't stop. Our field is not static. Every year I get to learn something new. The world, but the world is not changing the last 5 years. So embrace it. I'm an HR professional. I'm choosing this profession. So I should be really good at it. Because if I'm sitting on a business team, the manufacturing person, the salesperson, the quality person, they're experts at that. And they're expecting me to be the expert in HR. They don't need me to be doubling down on trying to learn, manufacturing quality systems so I can contribute to their work in that way, right? So don't shy away from being an expert in HR. And then I shared with you, for me, what's always been exciting. And I say, be present in the organization. So if you're thinking about a career in HR, or if you're in HR and you want to continue to grow, learn, get out there, talk to employees, be present, connect with them, bring your HR work to life for them, learn about their problems. And I think you'll find you're going to be better at it or much more inspired. And then no matter what, in an HR job, you have to represent the culture and you have to live the values. So if you don't want to live in a fishbowl and you're a little uncomfortable with that, you got to think twice, but that comes with the territory. So that's part of my last advice for folks. And finally, have fun, right? There's never enough hours in the day. There's always somebody that you're disappointing and that can take you down. So I really encourage people to find balance and realize your job isn't to make everybody happy. It's to do really good HR work. Do it fairly consistently with a guided set of values and principles, and then hold yourself accountable to that and recognize, just like a doctor, right? You're not going to be able to save every patient, right? So have that. So find balance and ways to care for yourself.
Wow, Christy, this has been amazing. Thank you very much for your time and for joining the podcast. As a friend of the BHRC out there in New York, we really appreciate you. And just really appreciated the time today.
Thank you so much. It was great to speak with both of you.
Thanks, Christy.